Well, today's guest is Katie McGrath. Katie is known to me as a colleague at 7 West Media and we've worked together. I've come to learn her story over the last few years and more recently reading her book called Deadly Earth. Katie's story is going to shock you and in parts it'll horrify you, but it is an inspiring story as to how she got through her teenage years. It is a great story. I'm not going to give too much away, but it is a story that will certainly touch many hearts. And as to how this could happen in our country is extraordinary. Also, right at the end of the podcast, Katie talks about life as an HR director. There's some really interesting comments that she makes about the way that companies are now dealing with people and how that interacts with social media as well. It's a really interesting hour chat, and I hope you enjoy Katie McGrath. Good afternoon, Katie.
Hi, David.
Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. It's a real privilege to be able to talk to you about your life, and as I'll describe in a moment, this is about inspiring others, and your story is an incredible one, which I'm about to get into. So for the listener, there is a connection that Katie and I have got. We work together at 7 West Media. I've watched you work and your leadership at 7 West Media, and as my role as a non-executive director. And for listeners, Katie is without question one of the most talented execs I've ever seen. So from where she has come from where she is today, it's a remarkable story, and a story I'm looking forward to bringing to our listeners. The idea for today came a couple of years ago when Katie did a piece to TV at Channel 7, and it was around the time that she launched her book, which we'll refer to through the course of the afternoon, called Deadly Earth, which, by the way, Katie's brilliantly written and beautifully written, and I'll refer to it through the course of the interview. Anyway, Katie, I had constantly talked about you and your story to my wife, and we're talking about guests, and she said, well, why don't you see if Katie will do it? So that's how the idea came, and I'm pleased you said yes.
Well, it's my pleasure. I don't think I really meet the standard of some of the other people that you've interviewed, but I'm happy to be here.
That's great. So I want you to start, and we're going to take you through, if it's okay, step by step, your childhood, and it is a remarkable story. And can I start by asking you to describe your parents and their relationship and how they were ostracised from their family?
Yeah, so my mum and dad were pretty typical Australians, I think, in the 60s, in their late teens and 20s. My mum was accepted to do a scholarship at Sydney University for medicine. Finally met my dad, which I only discovered recently was at the old Manly Pacific Hotel, where my mum was working behind the bar, actually. Anyway, Dad was a traditional working class Catholic boy from the inner western suburbs of Sydney, and my mum came from a pretty traditional Baptist Protestant family from the Northern Beaches, quite a well-to-do family, doctors and lawyers and high achieving, but both from Irish kind of stock. And so when they met, it was to the dismay of both families, and neither of the families approved of them getting together. But by all accounts, and I've only heard some of these accounts more recently, they were desperately in love. And who knows what happened, but they certainly ended up together. And one thing led to another, as it often does, and Mum ended up being pregnant before they were married. Which I think particularly in those days was absolutely shocking, not least of all that they weren't married, but, Protestant, Catholic, it was just a big disaster. So they ran off to Alice Springs, actually, and had my eldest brother back in the 60s. And, then their life kind of commenced from there. They came back to Sydney and had my second brother, and then a few years later had my sister, and 6 years later I think I was a big surprise to them when I came along.
And I think now I'd like to ask you to tell our listeners about Lot 17 Nelson Parade, Hunters Hill, which they had purchased. Were they married at the time when they purchased that, or they're about to be?
I believe they were married at the time they purchased it. We don't know anything about when they got married. I just know because of my birth certificate records, actually, that show that they were married. So all of my siblings were all illegitimate. I was the first legitimate child of the McGraths. And yeah, they had worked really hard in lots of businesses. Dad ended up being a builder. Mum had to drop out of her medical studies and ended up becoming the head of science at PLC. Which was quite esteemed in those days. And so they worked really hard and finally bought this dream house, which Dad was one for renovating and flipping houses quite a lot in those days, even separate to his building game. And so they bought this house right on the waterfront in Nelson Parade in Hunters Hill. And I think they were just super excited about it, but had no idea that they had just stumbled upon what was to be a death sentence for both of them.
And we'll go into detail as to what happened, but it turned out that site had radioactive waste that your whole family were obviously exposed to. And I'll talk in a moment about what happened, but are you concerned in the future for you as far as that exposure, or is that something that you're comfortable now?
Look, it's a really interesting question. I don't think any of us, having grown up there, are ever comfortable. My brother, who is still alive, has had really serious cancer bouts, not the same as the ones of my parents or anyone else in the street that died. So he hasn't had leukemia or stomach cancer, but he's had other cancers. I know my sister in the past had some cancer scares. I, touch wood, have never had anything like that so far. But, there certainly were stories of when I was a baby and we left Hunters Hill and everything, our lives had fallen apart, that I had some huge growth on my tongue. And, no one was talking about it at the time, and they were taking me to doctors to try and work out what it was. But everyone was fearful that, that was related to the radioactive waste as well.
Okay, we'll come back to that. But and by the way, Katie, how old were you when your mother first got sick?
I don't know exactly how old. I suspect I was probably 2-ish.
Yeah.
And she was dead when I was 3.
And if I can ask you and take you to that period of when your mum did get diagnosed, was very ill. Can you describe that time, and also obviously you're going to recount stories from your family, but also explain to the listener what happened with your father at the same time?
Yeah, so Mum obviously was diagnosed with leukemia, and she managed it and kept it a secret from the kids. We didn't know that she was that well until the very end. But most of my memories of my mum actually are visiting her in Sydney Hospital on Macquarie Street in the city. And that's pretty much how I remember Mum going in to visit her. It was pretty kind of bizarre. She was always in bed. I can remember the kind of biscuits and the nurses and all that kind of stuff, which is so bizarre given I was so little. But yeah, it was pretty scary. And I think because my parents they were just so desperately in love. It was really obvious to everyone around them. They're kind of still like teenagers in love. Dad just didn't cope very well. He was desperately upset. And then he became quite ill as well and didn't tell anyone what it was about. In fact, most of the neighbours in the street were watching him change colour and not look particularly well. And they were all worried that, he was so concerned about mum in hospital that it might be related to that, or that he had hepatitis. So everyone in the street got a hepatitis shot because they all thought my dad, Fabian, was ill with hepatitis. So he kept lots of secrets. And we don't even know when he absolutely became aware that he had stomach cancer, because he was just so desperate. And it was just a shocking time.
And can you remember your mum, Katie? Have you got a vision of her?
Yeah, I have a few flashes. I remember her, being in her bedroom, which was upstairs, which was after we'd left Hunters Hill, when we'd kind of rushed to escape. And we were living in Drummoyne, and they had this beautiful balcony that looked over the harbour. And I remember just flashes of mum getting in and out of the shower. Most of it was people cooking for mum and caring for her. So it's not a really active memory. I mean, a couple of memories, she dropped me to daycare one time, and I remember just being absolutely terrified for some unknown reason that she was leaving me alone and clinging onto the gate and saying, "Don't leave me, mummy." But yeah, not many memories.
And there's a beautiful moment that you described in the book, which certainly I shed a tear when I read this, is that you had this doll called Susie, and I think one of your last visits with her is that you put Susie next to her and said, "Susie has magic powers, and if you sleep with her, then you can come home," which is really lovely.
Yeah, so childlike, isn't it? Just that ability to imagine everything will be okay, and obviously the horror when it isn't.
Yeah. And the night before she passed, she had a bad experience in the hospital, didn't she, when she was left in a bath?
Yeah, it was terrible because I think she kept looking like she was going to get through the leukemia. And even in the 70s, it was pretty unusual for people to survive leukemia, whereas today lots of people actually get through it. But so she had these bouts where she'd kind of be really ill and then recover, and really ill and then recover. And actually she seemed to be recovering. And then we all had to leave one night, and yeah, she was put in the bath, and for one reason or another, I think the nurses forgot about her in there. And, she was obviously a very weak, ill woman. And by the time they came back to get her, the water was freezing. She couldn't get herself out. And lots of people said that was, pretty much the thing that finished her off.
We get to a part of the story now which is really important, that your mum is close to passing. Your dad is very ill with stomach cancer. You have some neighbours, and I'm going to ask you about those people in a moment. Alison and Ray, does that sound?
Yes.
That's right. So they're looking after you while your dad is looking after your mother or seeing your mum, and then he falls ill and goes to hospital. So, and there's conversations before your mum passed around who was going to look after the four kids. And because of the situation with the family, the family were estranged from a lot of the relatives, the choices are pretty bare as far as where you were going to go. Do you want to explain to the listeners what happened?
So mum and dad had become their own little family unit and not really in close contact with either side of their family. So when, they must have known it was looking more likely they were both going to die. They had 4 kids. The youngest was 3. They were desperate about who would take care of us, but not really organised. So they started working through who was possible. And my mum had a brother that she had some contact with. So my dad had reached out to this brother, Doug, and said, if I die, would you take all 4 kids? And he had 4 kids of his own, and said, look, I just can't do it, Fabian. I'm really sorry, but I could take the boys. And mum and dad must have discussed that and just agreed that was not going to be okay. And so after racking their brains, my dad must have come up with a cousin of his that he'd spent a little time with when he was growing up, a fellow called Ted Heffernan. And so he made contact with this distant uncle of ours we'd never met. and had asked him to, potentially take us all in. This uncle, obviously, who plays a pretty big role in the book and was a pretty terrifying and pretty awful person for all of us, ended up agreeing to take us. He had 3 kids of his own. He had a Hungarian wife. He had a Catholic background. And I think they saw, I can't think for what other reason other than being able to have access to my parents' estate, he would have agreed, other than, maybe there was something about doing the right thing, but that's not how it played out.
He really was a horrible person. But just around those decisions, and can you introduce to the listeners the neighbours, because Alice and Ray really like to know more about them, and whether you had relationship with them once you went to with the Heffernans.
Yeah. So Alison and Ray Balding, we had a really close street, the street that we moved to after Hunters Hill. No one quite knew what was going on with our parents, other than, it was weird. Mum seemed to be in hospital. And then they developed really close relationships. So there was a couple, Ray and Alison, who I don't think were actually very good friends with my parents, but they had 5 girls of their own. And their girls were about the same ages as my brothers, who were 8 and 9 years older than me. So they all became quite good friends. And as a result, we kind of just gravitated to being in their house a lot. It became very normal. Alison just loved children. She just loved having children around her. And so I think she had probably identified my dad was struggling, and, took more and more care of us. So interestingly, when it did come time for the Heffernans being the people that ended up taking us as foster parents, we all desperately had wanted to stay with the Baldings. And we did stay in contact with them. We were kind of pretty close friends. And it's only in the last kind of decade or so I've understood, what had happened there. Alison had talked apparently to my dad about taking us. He had said, look, it's a family matter. In those days, things were, about family as much as Ted Heffernan was family. I mean, he was a complete stranger to us. And so she had said to me, well, I stepped aside. It wasn't really appropriate for me to continue to push. And then it would have resulted in her having 9 kids, which was no small feat either. But we did stay in contact with them. It was kind of our release. For the first few years, we would go and have Christmas holidays for a few weeks with them, and that was kind of what kept us sane.
And did they have any idea as to the issues you were having inside the Heffernan home?
No, nobody had any idea. They knew that the Heffernans were very strange people. It was visible, it was obvious. Everyone in our local church would have seen. It looked like we didn't belong in this family. Ted was a very unusual looking man. He was 6'6". He was scary looking. He was an odd bod. He looked like an odd bod. He was a chartered accountant, and hence we'd always reflected thinking it was about the money, nothing else, because there was not an ounce of warmth or love or understanding. We were 4 really traumatized children, grieving, distraught. I didn't know what was happening, why we were all of a sudden going to, live with the Heffernans. It was really shocking.
Were you cross that your dad didn't provide a better will, and given he knew he was sick? And is that something you think about, that because there was a situation just before he died where lawyers were running around trying to find a way to get a will up and running? There was no will signed, was there?
There was no will signed. And look, I was, when I was younger, really cross. I was cross at him for dying most of all. But I couldn't understand how it could come to be. But as I've met a few more people who knew him, I actually think that Dad was not in a healthy state of mind, let alone physically. I think the degradation that had happened losing the love of his life, I actually don't think he was coping very well. And some of his behaviors, like, a few months before he died, he built like a proper bar in our lounge room.
Yeah, I read that story.
I mean, I can remember sitting at the bar. It was like being at the pub. He'd actually transformed our lounge room into a pub, and because he was a builder, he could do a very good job of it. So I don't think he was in great shape. I don't think he was really sharing the responsibility with anyone. I think he was, dying mentally as well as physically, and he just didn't get his stuff together. And it did happen very quickly. I mean, they died within months of each other. I don't think he actually believed he was going to die until the very last, few weeks.
And do you have recollections of the funerals?
Not one memory of anything. So I've done quite a lot of work in trauma and research, and I went and did my postgrad in psychology, probably trying to get a handle on what trauma does to people. And I actually have not one memory of any detail to do with their deaths, with their funerals, with anything that happened afterwards. So it's absolutely got blocked out. I cannot access it at all.
And Katie, do you have any memory of that day that the Baldings passed you, all 4 kids, across to the Heffernans?
I have the clearest memory of that day.
Really?
It's unbelievably clear. So we weren't, I don't even know if we were 100% sure of what was happening, but this was the day that the handover we lived with the Baldings for a number of months after our parents died, until all of the, organisation of us being transferred to the Heffernans and the house and all kinds of stuff. So we had lived with the neighbours, which was actually more comforting than anything, or having gone anywhere else, because we were so familiar with it. But on the day we were to be handed over to become the new foster children of the Heffernans, we were taken on a picnic to Lane Cove National Park, where the handover was to happen. And it was just the most horrific day. We went through the motions of having a pretend kind of picnic, but everyone knew what was happening other than the kids, really. And so at the end, we had to get into the Heffernan's car, to take us away. And I just remember the terror, the horror that this is actually happening and we're being taken away. And I tried to escape and I got thrown back in the car, and I'll never forget driving away. It was like a movie scene where the 4 of us were kind of up at the back windscreen, looking out the back windscreen, just kind of tearing down the glass, with my brothers were howling and just the tears coming out of their eyes. And I didn't really know what was happening. I just remember, bawling my eyes out, because I'd never seen my brothers, who were big, tough boys, so upset. So it was a terrible day. And it was a really clear omen of what was ahead.
Amazing. And I guess to put this into context, you had no relationship with this person. You had no relationship with his wife. I think you probably, from my understanding of the book, the kids had only seen him for a couple of hours when he visited your father.
Yeah, absolutely. He was as good as a complete stranger to us, as was his wife and his kids, who were my cousins. So yeah, it was really scary to all of a sudden arrive in a place that we'd never been before, and be told that, well, this is where you're going to live, and this is your Auntie Agnes. You can call me Uncle Ted. And, here are our kids. And they had 2 girls that were about my age, and actually an adopted Aboriginal boy who was a few years younger than me. And that was it. From then on, we were kind of trapped in this household of horror.
Yeah, well, there's lots of lessons to be learned out of this, but one of them has to be for everybody to have a well-constructed will, right?
Absolutely. But, that's right. Even if it was a well-constructed will, we might still have ended up in this family, because obviously Dad did not know what was to become of us. And, it's never stopped any of us thinking, my poor parents turning in their graves, knowing in their minds they did everything in their power on their deathbeds to try and protect us, only to have handed us into a really awful situation.
And Katie, so you arrive and immediately, almost the first night, you're aware that this person is not a good person. And so how long before you're subjected to violence and the sort of regime you then had to live under?
I can't really remember, David. I know that the first indications that things were not right was that it was really different. So we'd come from a family that was very loving, that was very tactile. Our mum and dad were clearly in love. So we were just in a really safe environment where normal to us was kissing and hugging. And when we went to the Heffernan household, everything was stiff, it was cold, it was soulless, it was scary. There was fear in, everywhere you turned, it was you were going to be hit for having said the wrong thing or for not having, eaten in the right way. So we knew really quickly that it was not safe. We just knew it. We felt it. It was a different environment. There was no one to cuddle or hug us. And I was a little kid. Like little kids get picked up and hugged all the time.
And tell the story about your beautiful brother Dan, because he was the eldest, but he was comforting you a lot, wasn't he? But he wasn't allowed to in the end.
They were such weird people that the concept of love and affection, and yes, Dan became my mum and dad all wrapped into one. And he was 9 years older than me, so he was a very big, comforting brother. He would cuddle and look after me and teach me and talk to me and just, treat me like an individual. Which most kids take for granted, but I didn't have that from anyone else. But the Heffernans turned that affection into a real trigger for them. And they would say comments like, "That's disgusting. Don't hug your sister like that. It's disgusting. It's wrong." And my siblings we'd all just be really confused, like, what's disgusting about this? We didn't understand it. And that would just send Ted into a rage, and he would punch, kick, just become really physically violent towards my brothers. And it was very confusing, but, I guess we learned very quickly how not to create a trigger for violence. And so, I remember sitting in church being really mindful that I didn't touch anybody next to me. In the car, I would make myself really small. Even though I was really small, I'd make myself smaller. So I just didn't touch anyone. So it was just all wrong.
And so how long did you stay in the Heffernan house? So you were there at sort of 4 or 5. So
I stayed there from 5 until the age of 18.
Wow.
My brothers and sister, who were, so my sister's 6 years older than me and my brothers were 8 and 9 years. So they were teenagers. They only had 4 or 5 years they kind of had to get through. And they were shocking years for them. And the violence was horrific for all of them. But, they got out, and the dilemma of getting out was they knew that they could get out. Well, my brother Greg, the younger brother, actually got kicked out when he was just about to turn 17 because he was personality-wise much more like my dad. And I think that was a trigger for my uncle. He didn't like that my brother was good looking, he was tall, he was full of charisma, and he started to give back, and he was fighting back. And so Ted just kicked him out one day and said, "You're out, mate. You spent your parents' money. I don't have anything more for you. Get out." Greg had nowhere to go. He was a kid. He didn't know how to survive. All he'd done was kind of cope with violence and try and get through school. So he ended up in some dive and took a part-time job, was just finishing school, had gotten into law, became a clerk at a law firm, and just had basically no money. He used to live off a packet of Tim Tams a week and surf. So, all these things avoidable. But yeah, it was pretty horrific.
So let's talk about Dan. So Dan, as you referenced before, is the eldest child. He's the one that's looking after you and your sister and your Greg you've just spoken about. And from the way you portray him in the book, which is beautifully done, by the way, and tell the listeners, which is the hardest thing I ever had to read, what happened to Dan.
Yeah, Dan was like my guardian angel. I'm sure we idolize people that are no longer with us, but he was my guardian angel. He looked after me. He did everything for me, and he made life more bearable. And he was really driven. When Dad had sat him down, I think a couple of nights before he died, and said, "Son, you're going to have to become the man of the family." This was when my brother was 12, 13. And Dan was like, how can I do that? I'm not a man. And my dad had just said to him, "Too bad. There's no other option. You're going to have to do it." And Dan took that to the letter of the law. He just took on the responsibility for all of us. He had 3 jobs by the time he was 21. He was studying at university. He was running a Sri Lankan restaurant in the city. He was doing 2 other jobs, and he desperately wanted to become a pilot. So he was saving up for his commercial pilot's license, but he
was also saving up to get you out of the Heffernans' house too, wasn't he?
That's absolutely right. He wanted to buy a house to rescue us all so that we could all live together, continuing that responsibility for us. But, he was still, early 20s, and my brother Greg and Dan stupidly went out one day and bought the most ridiculously overpowered motorbikes. They'd never ridden a motorbike before. They both got these motorbikes. They were just free and so excited. And Dan rang me one day and said, "I'm coming to pick you up for your birthday, and I've got a big surprise. I cannot wait to see you." And I was really excited, thinking it was going to be a great birthday present. But he eventually, on the day he was due to come and pick me up, never showed up because he was involved in a really hideous motorbike accident on the North Bridge, suspension bridge in Sydney. And he died quite soon thereafter. He was taken to North Shore Hospital. It was absolutely terrible, and he was dead, all on the day he was meant to come and take me out for my birthday. And the weirdest thing about trauma with that is that I have a really completely different memory of what happened when he died compared to reality. So I have this memory that a policeman, came to the house, knocked on the door when Dan was meant to be showing up, and explained that he'd been in a terrible accident. I could describe to you today what that policeman looked like, what his uniform was like, and the things that he said to us. But that never happened. There was no policeman that came to our house. We were rung and rushed to the hospital to try and, see if he would be revived or survive. And, apparently I sat there holding his hand as he died. And I have no memory of that. But I can tell you what the policeman, who never existed, was like.
Mm. And how old were you then, Katie?
I was 13.
So you're 13. Your mum and dad have passed. You've had to live with this awful family, and your shining light in life has just passed away. How, as a 13-year-old kid, how do you actually stomach the strength to go on and lift yourself out of what must have seemed like a massive abyss?
I just couldn't, David. I think it's a really interesting thing again about trauma. I shut down. I had never ever been taught how to express grief or any emotions. We were all shut down and just in fear for our lives a lot of the time in terms of the physical or sexual violence that was coming. And so I'd never learned how to grieve for my parents. So never having been through that process, everything was buried deep. And so when it came to my brother dying when I was 13 years old, I had no idea how to comprehend, how to process, how to dig myself out, or how to even contemplate it. We just went into shocked silence, all of us. And in fact, we didn't talk about my brother probably for 10 years after he died. It's exactly what had happened with our parents. When we went to the Heffernans, they said, "Your parents are gone, they're dead. don't mention them again. There's no point referring to them. And we never talked about my parents again after they died. So that's how we learnt how to process grief. And so when it came to my brother, that's exactly what I did. I just shut down. I think I told a group of friends once, and we never really talked about it again.
And so in many ways, the book must have been very hard to write, but was it a type of medicine to help?
It wasn't really the book. I mean, I had spent years later doing a lot of work on trying to deal and process the grief and work through all the trauma. So I'd spent a lot of money and a lot of time working through all that. So when it came to the book, it was actually quite traumatizing. And I saw a specialist in trauma therapy and a particular type of therapy that they use on NASA astronauts, actually, to separate mind and body. Anyway, complicated but very helpful therapy. And so because reliving some of that stuff was obviously pretty scary and a bit dangerous, to go back into lots of stuff that you shut down. And I never would have been able to write the book if it was about me in my mind, because that's just so self-indulgent. It's not what I was about. It was the only way I could rewrite it was because I was trying to do my part to get some kind of justice for my parents and tell their story. So it was a pretty traumatic process, but I kept telling myself it was worth doing because I was doing it for them.
And back to those awful days of the Heffernans. So were you abused, Katie?
Yes, I was, David. And, it's not something that I talk about much. It's not something that's easy to talk about. I've recently done an interview specifically in relation to child sexual abuse, and most of my interview was explaining why I don't talk about it in great detail, or any detail, and how triggering that can be. And I think because we're much better today in society hearing about, child sexual abuse, we're kind of a bit desensitized to it, and the Royal Commission into, institutional abuse, etc. But it is just the most horrific, awful thing, and it's very difficult for me to talk about it. I have it in a different zone in my body, and I don't go there much, and that's kind of how I cope.
So my next question is around how you got through it, and you referenced that you had therapy, but if you look back, what are the key people that got you through? And clearly your brothers were two who both played significant roles. Are there any other people that you look upon as saying, these people were really responsible for me to getting to where I am today?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I've had to cope mostly alone. And, when you really suffer and you don't share what's going on for you, which we didn't, you do deal with it on your own. I had an incredibly close group of school friends, my girlfriends from Loretto, Kirribilli, and they were my saving grace. They did not really know. They had no idea what was going on. I think they knew that I came from a very strange household. They weren't really, they didn't come to my household. I pretty much lived in my friends' houses. Once I was old enough to do that as teenagers, I would be there all the time. But they gave me the opportunity to kind of pretend to be normal. I looked normal. I learned how to behave normally. I think inherently I always had probably a pretty dynamic personality. I loved the idea of fun and hedonism and all that kind of stuff. So my friends gave me the opportunity to just tap into the fun and, everything being okay on the surface. But it was very much, I've done everything alone. It's pretty much been alone. My brother and I are very close, and I think we're probably the only two people in the world who really get each other and get how deep and shocking the life is that we've lived. Because, when you meet both of us, we both love a good laugh, and most people would just never know. But we really understand how difficult it's been for each of us. And I just don't, there's not really anybody else that's helped us get through.
And he must be a remarkable person as well. And again, you portrayed him really well in the book. So would you see him every couple of weeks? You speak to him every day? What's your relationship now with your brother?
We see each other, probably every month or so. We talk a lot. We annoy everyone whenever we get together at a lunch because we just talk the same language. We're both interested in deeper, more meaningful. We love to study people. We don't really do small talk. We're not really that interested in superficial stuff. And we really get that about each other. So we get into deep conversations, and sometimes people feel a bit kind of locked out. I know my ex-husband once probably felt a little bit excluded, and he once made this statement, which we now joke about, and he called us arrogant in our loss. You and your brother, you're so arrogant in your loss. I was like, what the?
Yeah, that doesn't really stack up, does it? And so just something that I think listeners would really, particularly people who've been in situations of grief and trauma, when there are triggers that bring back bad times, how do you get through that? Because there must be times where it does resurface. What are some of the things that you could tell our listeners as to how some of the skills that you've learnt to get yourself through?
The most important thing when you feel the impacts of trauma or grief or whatever starting to overcome you is to listen to it, to absolutely be present in it and accept it, and be really calm in understanding this is what's happening. Label it. I'm suffering. I'm really feeling low. I'm really feeling overwhelmed. And accept it, be present with it, and acknowledge that it's also now just part of who I am, and it doesn't have to overwhelm me. I have the power and the control over me. It doesn't have it over me. The most dangerous thing you can do with trauma and grief is pretend it's not happening. I think actually the epidemic that we have in anxiety today is as a result of people losing the skills and the ability to be able to express their emotions. You have parents saying, oh, don't be silly, don't be upset, don't cry. Actually, I think that's the antithesis of what we should be doing. We need to learn how to express our emotions, how to understand them, how to label them, and then how to deal with them. And very much part of me today is my grief, is my trauma, is my genuine empathy for other people in pain, because I've been through it. So in many ways, it's been absolutely horrific, but it's also a huge gift that I have a way to care for other people in a genuine, deep way, only because I've had so much pain and suffering. So I think acknowledge it, accept it, and know that it doesn't have to sustain forever. It's just part of you.
Yeah, and I've seen that firsthand from you. I think that's a great skill that you have. Can we now talk about the day that you found out about the contamination of Hunters Hill and what has now transpired and where that journey is taking you in your life?
We had no idea, right? Our parents died. They dropped dead within months of each other. We had no idea what had happened. No one talked about the fact that it was contamination related, although we believe my parents knew that they were dying from the radioactive waste. So nothing ever got mentioned about why they died. We just thought it was a tragic coincidence. In 2008, 30 years later, I'm reading the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald, and it says, cancer cluster and deaths in Nelson Parade, Hunters Hill, maybe as a result of radioactive waste from a uranium processing factory that was built there in the early 1900s before anyone knew radioactive waste was dangerous. And so I read this on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald and went, oh my goodness, my parents lived in that street. This is all going click, 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 click. And it all started to make sense that maybe that's why they died. So I rang my brother. He was in shock. We just couldn't believe it. And that was the start of my mission, to try in some small way to find justice for my parents. And so I did lots of digging. I started doing researching. I felt like Erin Brockovich. I kind of went to meet old kind of neighbours, heard their stories, found stuff. And so, and that story had only come out on the Sydney Morning Herald because it was due to freedom of information. So all this hidden information that the New South Wales government had kept under wraps was no longer able to be kept private. And so all these files and health department information became public, which made very clear that all the deaths, and there were a number of deaths that had happened in this street, all leukemia and stomach cancer from residents, was as a result of having been exposed to the radioactive waste.
Where are you going to take this in the future, Katie?
Well, there's a few things. I've tried to commence legal proceedings some years ago. I put that on hold for a raft of reasons. I was obviously a witness in the parliamentary inquiry, which resulted in, the recent announcement this April where the New South Wales government committed to finally remediating the site. And by remediating it, it's ended up having to be shipped out of the country to the US. That's how big a deal it's been politically. So what can I do now? Well, most of all, I want my book to be made into a movie or a series. And I've also got some open discussions happening with New South Wales government at the moment. My lawyers have been interacting with the New South Wales government directly to ask about what their redress or plan for redress is for residents such as us, who have parents that died wrongful deaths, avoidable deaths. The New South Wales government knew that this site was contaminated. They inappropriately falsified health certificate documentation to say that this site was clear and safe for residential habitation. And so unknowing residents bought this land whilst the New South Wales government knew that it was contaminated and dangerous. And so, wrongful death and pain and suffering are the current claims that, we'd like to see rectified. Nothing will bring my parents back, and I'm really happy that the site's being rectified for current residents because I think it's been really stressful and difficult for them. But nothing is the same as losing your life, and for us, losing any semblance of having any kind of family or family life.
That is absolutely true, and I think reading in the book about the path you've been on, it must have been incredible to keep finding out the information you were getting and just the mistakes that were made along the way. It must have made you very mad.
It made me furious because it was avoidable. It was quite simply avoidable. It was the New South Wales government, the health department, all they had to say was this land is not for sale, and until we fix it up, and even if that's decades later, no one can live here. So they knew that. Bureaucrats knew that they should not have been selling this land.
Well, the book is called Deadly Earth. It is a must-read for everybody. So for the listeners listening, you really, really should read it. If I could turn the interview's attention now to your career, Katie, which is fair to say I think is only just starting. I think you've got an amazing career in front of you. Do you like your job?
Do I like my job? Depends on the day that you ask me that. It's a very intense job when you work in media, as you know. There is never a dull moment and there is always something to be managed and taken care of. But yeah, look, I love working with people. I love working in a dynamic environment. I think I'd be bored if I worked in a bank. And so, yeah, I really love being able to turn something that is not in great shape into fantastic shape. And I've done that a few times in my career now, and we're certainly on a journey to doing that at Seven.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting to me is that the journey you've been on, and the trauma you've been through, but you are so good with people. I mean, for people listening to this, Katie's role as Chief People and Cultural Officer at Seven West Media. And I did want to talk to you about the role of human resources, because from when I started in business, that role was about, payroll, contracts, calculating annual leave and things like that. But the role is so much different now, isn't it, around being a motivator, understanding how to get the best out of people, looking at incentive programs and retention programs, and really being quite innovative with the way we manage people and the way that we assess people. Where do you think this role could go? And I'm not just talking about Seven West, I'm talking about this role in business and the role that it plays in society.
Well, you're right. We can see how much the role of HR has transformed over, several years. And for me, the best leaders, the best CEOs are the ones that know how to unlock the power of their people. We all talk about people, particularly in services, businesses, where people are our greatest assets. But is that really how we lead or run our executive teams? So I think the CEOs that partner very closely with their HR lead and really understand the power of unlocking the potential in people are the businesses that are by far and away the most successful. We know there's all the other metrics, and we know diversity helps in terms of thinking and profit. We know that gender balance, all of those things, which HR plays a really important role in facilitating. But HR that operates on its own is no good. It's very much about being in really close business partnership with strategy, with CEO, with finance, with all parts of the business. So I think the future is only more relevant, particularly as we move into the digital economy and we see more and more technology automating manual tasks and lower level work. And it means that the higher order work and all of the humanistic and the judgment and the emotion and creativity can be unlocked. That can only be done with people that feel safe, engaged, motivated, free, inspired, all of those things. So yeah, I think there's certainly a long way to go, but we're making a good start of it.
And it's really interesting, isn't it, with the impact of artificial intelligence and the role that might play in managing people, and the impact that social media is having on the way people run their lives as well, both professionally and socially. So HR will have to get involved in that, won't it?
Absolutely. I think there's untapped opportunity. And I think, but you can never underestimate the power of humanity or human touch. We see it in all those studies with babies who die when they're fed and they're looked after, but there's no human touch. And I think actually we've seen that in the mental health epidemic through COVID. All these people remote, not connecting in the same way. There is nothing that makes up for human touch and connection and close quarter interaction. So there will always be a role for human emotion, human creativity, something that no matter the level of AI we have, humans will never be redundant.
And my last question, I'll let you go. And if you've listened to a couple of the podcasts we've done, you'll know that this question's coming. And yours is in two parts. So what would you say to the 13-year-old Katie McGrath that had been through all of that?
It's a really good question. I would say, and this is pretty intense, don't let things get so bad that you feel you have no option other than to take your own life, because there is a way out. And you need to ask for help, and you need to find an adult or someone that you can trust to tell them and to ask for help. There is always a way, and taking your life is just not an option. It's not a good option. Don't do it.
And back when you were 5, what would you say?
you're going to be okay. It's going to be a bloody long, hard road. But don't give up, because your DNA means that you're a fighter and you'll get through. It's just going to be a tough road, but there'll be fun in the end.
Well, Katie, thank you so much for sharing your story. This has been a wonderful hour, and you're an inspiration to a lot of people. Thanks for, and I know it must be tough to have written this book and to talk about it, but what it will do to people's lives is pretty significant. And if you can touch and influence people's lives, that's a great thing.
Thanks, David. I've really enjoyed it, and great, insightful questions.
Thanks, Katie.